When you struggle with imposter syndrome, it can become easy to get trapped into an unhealthy cycle in your career and lose focus of your goals. One of the ways to help you overcome, or at least recover from imposter syndrome thoughts, is understanding your own patterns and triggers. And here's the fun part many times the trigger could be your boss. Aren't we all lucky? So, to help us learn how to identify our imposter syndrome triggers is Dr. Lisa Orbe-Austin, who is a licensed psychologist, executive coach, and author of Your Unstoppable Greatness. Dr. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren.
All right, Dr. Lisa, tell us a little bit about your background and why it was important for you to write a book that sort of did focus on imposter syndrome, or at least had a lot of that in it with the advice you're giving.
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist and executive coach, probably for the past 15 years. I've been in private practice, working with high potential managers and executives. And the reason why my area of expertise is imposter syndrome is because I had it myself, and I dealt with it throughout my educational career. And it tracked me even finishing my doctorate and into my first jobs. And I actually had a really toxic boss. And I talk about this in my TEDx talk, but I had a really toxic boss. I was paralyzed, felt like I couldn't leave the job. I couldn't change jobs because my imposter was telling me that I would never get anything better, that this was as good as it got, that nobody else would want me. All of these narratives that imposter kind of engenders. And I just kept putting up with it. And it kind of kept getting worse until I was in a meeting with a largely female, actually completely female senior team. And there was music playing in the background. And my toxic boss at the time said, somebody asked, what's that music that's playing in the background? And he said, it's music to soothe the savage breast. And in that one moment, I just decided that I just can't live with this thing anymore. I'm not going to stay here. I have to really face it. And so I quit the job and really head on faced my imposter syndrome and really started to deal with it very head on, because I just was like, this is a pattern for me and I need to stop it. And I can't keep living like this. And so in doing my own work around it, it became a passion. I started writing about it, and that's how the books came about. The editor saw the writings and asked me if I would write a book on the topic. And so it's been a passion to be able to free as many people from imposter as I possibly can, because I know what it's like to deal with it.
I was going to ask, when you are doing your executive coaching, do you find that it comes up all the time, some of the time, none of the times?
I think in the beginning when I was doing it, it was some of the time, and some of the time not. Now it's all the time, because most
Right, because
people
you're the expert. Yeah.
come to specifically to deal with that. So it's more all of the time kind of now, which I really enjoy. I really have always loved a client who's dealt with imposter, because they're so amazing and they're so brilliant and capable, and there's so much possibility in their lives, but they don't see that. And so part of my work is to help unleash that possibility and give them freedom to utilize that for their own dreams and goals. And that's so fun for me.
Yeah. I want to talk about how we can identify toxic work cultures. I think it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, and there's a lot of memes out there that, joke about bad bosses and bad workplace, but like at the end of the day, it is work, right? This is not like supposed to be a party with your friends. And so what actually defines a toxic work culture, and maybe what are some things we could look out for to identify, like, are we actually in this, or like, hey, is this maybe just not the right job for us, but the work culture itself is maybe fine?
Yeah. So I think, like you had said, like toxic work cultures are sort of a vague term for places where you don't feel like you're thriving because of the culture, not necessarily what you're actually doing, not the work itself, but the actual ways that people function, interact, engage, treat others. That is sort of what we're looking at. And when we look at imposter syndrome and the particular types of toxic cultures that we're susceptible to, they're usually one of two types. One, sort of a codependent work environment where everyone is treated like a family. There's no room for conflict or dissent. There's often a lot of backroom chit chat, but it's not coming to the fore and being dealt with. Oftentimes, if you're going to want to leave, people think of it as a betrayal. There's a lot of kind of really toxic behavior going on between people, but it's really kind of like, there's infighting and all these things, but none of it's being dealt with. And so that's the kind of one. And the second one is having a narcissistic boss who kind of really creates this narcissistic dynamic where they're in charge and they're like king or queen of the unit, and they're sort of in whatever they want is what happens. They don't allow for other people to grow, to thrive. it's really about their kingdom and what they're creating. They really they don't like dissent. They don't like to be challenged. They will silence you if you embarrass them. Like these kinds. And the reason why is because oftentimes codependent and narcissistic dynamics underlie why we ended up with getting imposter syndrome. And so these things can be familiar to us. And so we often unconsciously are pulled into these kinds of arenas thinking like, oh, I know this kind of work environment, but we know it for a negative reason, not a healthy and positive reason.
So it's almost like you take the job and in the beginning you're like, I feel good here. I know this, like this is something about this feels familiar. And then maybe later on, as you start to do this work, you're like, oh, I know why this is familiar, because this is like a pattern that I have, is picking a place that makes me feel like I can never leave, or I should be so thankful, right? Or something like that. Like anytime you ask for something, they make you, like, they gaslight you into thinking like, wow, you are so lucky I'm giving you this 1% raise. I cannot believe you're not so grateful, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And it's because it's so familiar, we've seen it 1,000 times before, we begin to think that is all of work. Like all work is like that. And it's not true. We just happen to be more familiar with toxic dynamics and can get pulled into them much more simply. We don't see the red flags, and we don't, when we see the red flags and we start to notice them, we don't actually pay attention to them and make other decisions as a result.
Yeah. I remember I had a friend that worked at a lot of bad places. And I remember telling her once, especially in like the line of work I do, probably similar to you, where you like see good examples and bad examples. I was like, work doesn't have to be like this. Like not every place you work is like this. And it just sort of blew her mind because that was all she knew. And, it's almost like I wish we could have this like reality show, which would be very boring, of like a healthy workplace, right? So people could be like, oh wait, this
it
maybe
does exist.
Yeah, it does exist.
When you've been through these kinds of work environments over and over again, you really truly believe there's nothing healthy about work. Work is always like this. So when you see the signs, you're just like, this is just what work is. You don't start to recognize, no, this is a toxic workplace and I don't have to be in one.
I was thinking too, like, what if you are the toxic person? Like, what if your imposter syndrome gets so bad that then like you become, like in the codependent example, like you start to become that toxic person who's doing the gossiping in the, the lunchroom and that kind of thing. I would imagine imposter syndrome can graduate to more levels.
Yes. And actually we have a whole chapter in the new book about sort of the leadership pitfalls around imposter syndrome, because it's sort of creating this feeling that you don't belong, that you potentially are a fraud, that you're not good enough. You can, as a leader, engage in behaviors that are problematic. For example, you can be very micromanaging because you're very concerned about how your direct reports reflect back on you. Mm-hmm. You can be kind of very difficult around mistake making because you're very worried about what that mistake will do for you or your leadership or your opportunities. So we can have these pitfalls around our own leadership that we have to be very conscious of, because we can fall into them thinking that we're doing the right thing or thinking that we're being like, sitting on the moral high ground, but oftentimes we're actually creating toxic work environments around us. So yes, it is incredibly important to recognize that it doesn't only affect you, but it affects how you lead and how you manage others.
Wow. It's a slippery slope for sure.
Mm-hmm.
How can you understand your own patterns and how they play out in interpersonal relationships at work? I mean, like what's step one in understanding, okay, is this person triggering my imposter syndrome? What's my pattern with this stuff? I mean, where do you start with all this type of work?
So we typically start in figuring out, how did it all get started? How did your imposter syndrome get started? Because oftentimes people are like, I don't know how I got this thing. Yeah. Everyone has it or says these things, but actually there are real reasons why somebody actually develops these things. So for example, sort of looking at sort of the origin means sort of looking at early family dynamics and childhood roles that you may have been sitting in, unbeknownst to you, and they have sort of set the groundwork for the imposter syndrome developing. For example, there are 3 types of childhood roles people are often in when they have imposter syndrome. One is that they were the intelligent one in the family. So they were the one who is really smart. And as a result of that, everything should have come easy to them. So when things were hard, they started to feel like, oh, well, see, I'm not as smart as everyone thinks I am. It was the burgeoning of this idea of fraudulence. But they didn't sort of realize everyone has to, even as smart as, no matter how smart you are, you have to work on things. That's just the nature of developing and growing. The second type is the hardworking type. Oftentimes in these cases, somebody else was assigned the intelligent one. So you became the one who had to grind in order to get things done. And so it became this idea that nothing came easy to you. Everything was the grind. You never got to see your natural skills or talents, never got to see them as a real thing. But oftentimes we see also a correlation between the hardworking type and people who have had learning differences or learning difficulties, and sort of feeling like in order to kind of catch up with their peers, they had to overfunction. And even when they get the help, they still overfunction. And then the third type is survivor. So this is when your parent or caregiver wasn't giving you feedback around being intelligent or hardworking, either because of abuse or neglect. And for you, achievement meant escaping, getting out of the circumstance you were in. And so everything feels very fragile. If you're always afraid to lose what you have in front of you, because it means it could completely all go away, which often isn't true, especially when you're more senior in your career, but it always feels like that. So these kinds of roles can then lead to certain patterns of the way we show up at work. So if we're the intelligent one, we always have to be the know-it-all at work and always know the most, and never, kind of feel like we can say we don't know something or are learning something. If we're the hardworking one, we're always, busting our butts at work and working overtime and 80 hours and 90 hours. Like, we just know that's the way we show up, And so these kinds of things are part of understanding then how we came to be who we are in our workplace and why the patterns look the way they do.
So would a person maybe like track their, relationships or their interactions, their interpersonal interactions with people at work, for like a week or a month or something, and to try to determine, like, I mean, maybe just hearing you explain that, people understand. They're like, I know when I was listening, I was like, oh yeah, I'm kind of a mix of like 2 and 3. And I'm sure if I did more work, I could nail that down even more. But I wonder if people just hearing that can recognize, and then I guess, like, or track to understand, like, okay, when I interact with this person, I really struggle to be wrong. Or when I interact with this person and they micromanage me, I feel like they're about to fire me. Like, why do I have this feeling of like it's going to go away tomorrow? Right.
Yep. Yeah. And I think you're trying to sort of understand the layers of sort of what happened to get it started that are unique to you, and then connect that to what's happening at work. So we don't want to necessarily look back at this just to blame people or kind of be like, oh, this is how it got started. Look at all the bad things you did. But we want to connect it to our current day living so that we can understand, okay, this is why I get drawn into this. And what we sort of challenge people to do is kind of then, how do we broaden the roles and the ways in which we show up at work? It's okay to ask questions. It's okay not to know. You can still be an expert and mess up. These two things can coexist. But when we have imposter, we think in very black and white terms. And so we're trying to help people broaden the ways that they show up at work with roles that are much more complex than the ones they were potentially assigned or told could be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the managerial types that really trigger this imposter syndrome too. I mean, part of this is obviously your own work, right? So recognizing when you have it, how the pattern, whatnot, but which types of bosses should we also watch out for, because they're going to really trigger it more than somebody else.
Yeah, so we talk about these 5 types of bosses. The first one being perfectionistic bosses who are really caught with the one mistake that you made and not sort of the holistic kind of stuff that you've done or contributed to.
Right.
They can be very focused on kind of like perfection is the goal. Insecure bosses. So these are bosses who are not comfortable in their position. And so as a result, they're very concerned about the way you'll represent them. So they can get very overly involved in the way that you show up and how you show up, and it has to look like them. Erratic bosses. So these are bosses who show up one day loving your work, the next day hating it. They're very hard to predict. The goalposts are always moving around in directions that are really hard to understand. And so you're constantly very attuned to them, trying to make sure that you're showing up in the right way for them. Prove it to me bosses. These are bosses who are really caught up with like sort of saying like, you're only as good as your last project. You're only as good as the last thing you've shown me. And so you're constantly trying to up the game every single time to kind of get them to recognize that you're good enough. And then lastly, the withholding boss. The withholding boss is the boss that, sort of says, unless you kind of knock it out of the park, I'm not going to like comment or give you positive feedback. And they're sort of seeking for you to constantly pursue them for that positive feedback by kind of really doing more and more and more. And so those are generally the types that we see that are most triggering of imposter, making you feel not good enough, making you feel like you're a fraud, making you feel like you're not, capable of being where you're at.
Wow. I mean, I feel like you articulated those so well. And I feel like there are people right now who are I think if you have one of these bosses, when you hear it articulated and explained like that, you're like, my boss is number 2, my boss is number 3. And if you're not, what if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I'm not really sure if my boss is one of those? Does that mean that maybe you have a somewhat healthy boss relationship?
Yeah, I mean, there are other toxic bosses that I'm not probably talking about here.
Yeah.
I'm mostly talking about the ones that I see as the number one, like kind of, or the high
Yeah.
ranking triggers for. You might have a boss who doesn't trigger your imposter syndrome, but you still struggle with imposter syndrome. I've had that where I
Yeah.
feel like I have a lovely, wonderful boss is like cheerleading me on, but I still am like, I don't belong here. You made a mistake. And that they're not necessarily triggering, and I'm having some other trigger from some other place,
I
that I'm
feel like
responding to.
sometimes when your imposter syndrome comes out at work too, if you do have a healthy boss, you're like, well, I gotta have someone to blame. Like, again, this is gonna be someone's fault, and like you're at the top, and so poor bosses, I feel like they do get blamed, when it's good or when it's bad too. But I want to also talk about, before we get into some specific interview questions that you can ask to help identify this, you also talked about these leadership pitfalls. So what are the common leadership pitfalls for managers struggling with imposter syndrome? Because they have it too.
Yeah, and so I think, yeah, we see it at all levels. Oftentimes you hear this kind of myth that it's an early career phenomenon. There are no cohort effects in the research. It can go on throughout your entire
Yeah.
career. And so for leaders, what we typically see is the micromanaging component around sort of being overly involved because you're very worried about how people perform and how it reflects on you. The piece around mistake making, really having difficulty utilizing mistakes in a positive way as a learning experience rather than punishing or seeing it as a fault of the person that they're making that mistake. We also see it in opportunities to kind of leverage an award, an accolade for the team, something the team has done. They will tend to kind of like not utilize that moment and try to kind of like hide again because they're worried that maybe the team didn't deserve it, maybe another team deserved it, maybe someone will complain and say somebody else deserved it more. So they don't want to seek that, or they're trying to avoid that criticism. So they don't actually utilize those moments to support the team. They also can have difficulty kind of understanding where, as a leader, that they fall in connection to other leaders, typically kind of rating themselves beneath, how others would rate them. So they can tend to kind of like underestimate their own qualifications or own kind of ability to actually lead. So they can really show up in ways that, kind of are insecure and uncomfortable with their leadership as a whole. So those are some of the ways that they can show up, and it's oftentimes have trouble advocating, also to have trouble with conflict. There are a variety of ways that the imposter syndrome shows up in their actual management.
Yeah. I feel like I could see this happening a lot with like the middle management level too, because you are in the middle. And so you really are caught between these two. And I think what happens a lot with middle managers is they're like, I'm here. Do I want to go to the next step? Can I handle the next step? I'm not good enough for the next step. And so what about some advice on like how, for someone who's in management who really wants to develop more of this like healthy management style, what are some tips around that?
Yeah, I think one of the things is to really be open to what you're struggling with and be able to kind of either deal with it with a coach or deal with it with some support, but really start to talk about the things that are going on with your leadership and figuring out, how am I going to actually address this? Whether it's my own self-work or work with somebody else. But I think it's so important to kind of be able to say, like, I'm not doing X or Y or Z well. Even if you don't have to say it publicly to your manager, you have to say it to somebody that's going to help you actually do it. And I think really trying to then kind of work on some of if it's imposter syndrome underlying, work on the actual imposter syndrome stuff that's going on. It's really, people often believe that imposter syndrome is with them forever and they can never get rid of it. And our work has shown that like you can actually get rid of it in a very short period of time, about 14 weeks, you can actually reduce it by 30%. So that's pretty significant. So you can actually change it. And there are really concrete skills that you can use, because if you don't use them, you're going to affect the way either the people, your direct reports, are able to leverage the work that they're doing with you to actually escalate their own careers. You're going to affect the toxicity and the way the team is functioning. So I think it's really important to do your own work, to build your own skills, and to recognize, even in leadership and management, we always don't have it 100% right.
Yeah.
We should be growing forever. Even as CEOs and senior C-suite people, you should still be growing. You should never be like, I've got this, but there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean you're incompetent because you're still learning. Like that actually means you're still alive.
Yeah. This is a good thing. Okay, I'm obsessed with what you said about we can overcome imposter syndrome in somewhat of a short time. I agree. 14 weeks is really not that long in the grand scheme of things. What does this mean? Where do we go? Where's this 14-week program? I hope it's on an island also that we get to have like a mini vacation while we
I
do it.
wish.
I know. Tell me about Dr. Lisa. Have you considered buying an island? No, just kidding.
Yes,
Wait,
next
explain
on the
this to me
agenda.
because I want to know where and how we would do something like that.
Yeah. So our first book, Own Your Greatness, was about the research-backed steps that it took to overcome imposter. And we actually looked over the 40 years of academic and social science research that had actually studied it. And we used some of the interventions that had been most successful. So some of them, although I had mentioned the figuring out how this all got started, trying to understand the origins of your imposter syndrome, try to understand the way imposter syndrome looks specifically for you, being able to then, so we have this 9-step model called the 3Cs model, and that's the model we've been able to show can reduce it. And we actually do have a boot camp that we give like once or twice a year that actually kind of concentratedly gets you to go through it, because sometimes with the book, there are hard moments. The book is very friendly looking, but it's rough. There are some things you have to face that are not so pleasant. And so we kind of help you through the boot camp actually move through the steps consistently in a structured way. But it's things like learning how to recognize an automatic negative thought and then how to reframe that automatic negative thought. Learning to kind of not do, we are often our lone wolves. And so learning how to build community and thoughtful, structured, particular types of community around you as you work on it. To embed self-care as fundamental into our lives. We're often very burnt out, chronically burnt out, and we don't know how to actually embed self-care. We often do it as like if I have a little time, I'll do some self-care. We don't actually know how to see it as fundamental. Doing things like kind of working on those roles and really helping you to understand that you might always be a superhero at work or be the volunteer, but how do you learn to have different roles that make you still valuable on a team, but don't make you feel like you're only valuable if you do X.
Yeah.
And so really learning to kind of do these things very specifically and actually engage them in your work life becomes the way to overcome it. And we've seen it happen time and time again. And like I said in the beginning, like it's so wonderful because oftentimes people who have imposter syndrome are really amazing, successful, credentialed, experienced, and they just haven't learned, they haven't internalized it. So they don't actually know what they can do with it. And once they realize what they can do with it, the possibilities are sort of endless, and sort of it's an exciting thing to see people feel their own power. And so
I was just thinking, like, can you imagine the like smart, successful person who's been doing negative self-talk for 30 years? What happens when they all of a sudden do positive self-talk? Like you're like, it unleashes this like incredible version of that person, right?
It does. And it's so thrilling because sometimes when people come to us, we see them and we're like, oh my God, you're an architect, you're an engineer. You're literally, we work with rocket scientists and they're like, but I'm awful at what I do and I'm not good enough. And then what they're taking sometimes, I've heard horror stories of people being asked to like clean the floors and like be treated really horribly. And then when they're done, that they look at that circumstance and they're like, no, I'm not gonna clean the floor, or I'm not gonna stay here. Like I have opportunity outside of here, but it sort of opens that up in them. And I think that's the piece that's, when we see it, it's just, it's like shocking every time seeing it for the first, it's like you're seeing it for the first time. You've been noticing it 1,000 times before.
I love that. Okay, so kind of switching gears, but I think the natural question is so you have to deal with your own imposter syndrome. That's sort of part one, no matter what. Part two is maybe trying not to go work for a boss that triggers this imposter syndrome, right? So you said that you've got some interview questions that people can ask in their next interview, potentially even maybe start asking to their boss if they're still working there, to really to figure out if this person is going to trigger their imposter syndrome. What are those interview questions?
Yeah, so I would say it's both interview questions and then do your investigations, use your network and other people, because sometimes people are not going to tell you the truth and they have these
they never
these
tell you
answers.
the whole story. They're going to tell you the best version. And I love talking to the ex-employees too, because those are the people who are they're not going to sugarcoat
they're not going to hold back.
You might need to take that with a grain of salt because they really aren't going to tell you the best, right? But sorry, go on.
No, I think that both investigations are so important. So I think you want to ask questions like, when someone makes a mistake on your team, how do you approach it? So you want to hear sort of more of a growth mindset perspective around that. Like, we all learn from mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes. You don't want to hear like, there's no room for that. We have no time for that. There's no space for that. You don't want to hear things that kind of really kind of indicate they don't like mistake making, because that's pretty problematic for you. You want to also be able to hear things like, tell me how you actually invest in people's growth and development over time. So you really want to, you don't want that narcissistic boss where you're there to kind of do their bidding and make sure that their career goes nicely, but yours is like, whatever happens, happens.
You
So
work for them. Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to hear a plan for how they invest in people's learning and development and actually help them advance. It also is an indicator too, when they can give you concrete examples or tell you that they're not a codependent work environment, because codependent work environments don't want you to go anywhere. They want you to stay put. And so like when they can actually say, yeah, I helped so-and-so become vice president and this is how I did it, when they can actually give like concrete examples, that can be really helpful. You also want to, ask about, the team culture and what is it like? What are they specifically engaged in around sort of helping to make sure the team has a healthy, happy, functioning culture? And look for really concrete examples of what they're doing and not just some fluff. Because you want them to have an intentionality about how things like conflict are managed, or how the team is managed, how they sort of think about culture. Culture doesn't happen by accident. It should be around, it does happen by accident, but it shouldn't. It should be intentional, the kind of culture you're trying to create. You also want to, ask them about, work-life balance. Like how is this job kind of like, how this particular department or how they run things, do they kind of support people having a personal life and a balance? Because places where that's not the case are very inducing of overwork tendencies, which are very central to imposter syndrome. So those are some of the questions that you want to kind of be asking for. You want to be asking pointed questions, trying to get underneath, also too, like performance reviews and feedback. How is that given? How often do you give it? How central do you find it to kind of developing people? All of this, you want someone that wants to give you feedback consistently, and you're not never surprised by what you hear. It's not like you hear in a performance review for the first time. You want them to be open to giving you both positive and kind of constructive feedback in a helpful way.
Yeah, I think feedback, and what's interesting about feedback also for the women listening is that oftentimes women are given less specific feedback. So,
Subjective.
Yeah, and it's like we kind of talked about those ex-employees, or when you do their investigation, like that's a really good question to ask whoever you're talking to. Like, do you get specific feedback from this boss, or are you just given really general feedback? And you mentioned earlier, like the goalpost is always moving or the finish line is always moving. I find that a big struggle for people when they're unhappy in their job is they lack role clarity too. And so, to your point about that, so that's just a very important thing for women to watch out and listen for too, is like, hey, is he getting really specific feedback and I'm being told I'm just doing a good job, which doesn't really tell me very much, right?
Yep. Or telling you sort of like, we don't like the way you're showing up in the meeting. You don't have really executive presence, or you're having trouble with communication, but then there's no concrete description of what's happening in the communication that's a problem, or what specifically around your executive presence, in quotes, it is really the issue. So we can get a lot of really subjective and negative feedback that we don't know what to do with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would love for that to stop. I feel like the jargon and the subjective stuff, it just leaves people even more confused. And talk about triggering imposter syndrome, right? My goodness. Well, Dr. Lisa, this was fantastic. You gave us such good concrete examples and some good stories in there as well. So tell people where they can find you, follow you. Obviously, you've got a couple books, so mention those as well.
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Dr. Orbe-Austin, and also on LinkedIn. And I'm on LinkedIn Top Voice there, so I'm pretty active. And I have 2 books: Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life, and Your Unstoppable Greatness, Break Free from Imposter Syndrome, and Achieve Your Ultimate Career Goals. So those 2 are
amazing.
Out.
We will put all of those in the show notes. So anybody who didn't have a pen to write that down, don't worry, I'll put those in the show notes. And also, if we have it, we'll put some information to your boot camp information that you have as well. So
awesome.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Lisa.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Lauren.